Today we hope to finish gender, gender development, sex differences. And we had left, so we were discussing the different influences of different culturizing, socializing agents in the child's life. We talked about parents and peers, and now we are going to talk a little bit about siblings. Now, not everybody has a sibling. Some people are one child, only children. And so can I get a sense of how many of you have brothers or sisters? Most of you, okay. And so, and only children, we're going to also talk about later too. Sometimes there's false information, urban myths that, you know, only children are at risk. They aren't actually at risk with proper social support. Now, siblings do actually reinforce and teach one another about gender stereotypes. If not twins or triplets, usually they come in various ages, meaning the older children have an influence on the younger children. And it does depend on whether a child or how much a child gets gender information does depend not only on the birth order, so is this child the oldest, the youngest, the middle, but also family size. Same-sex siblings seem to show more gender stereotype behavior. So if you have two girls or two boys, for example, in a family, those might actually, and they are the only kids, they may show more gender stereotyping, but there are exceptions. We will just discuss them in these coming bullets. Only children follows them, and different sex siblings actually show lower gender stereotyping, but in larger families, so a family with 3, 4, 5 children, same-sex siblings may also reinforce less gender stereotyping because they may want to differentiate themselves from their same-sex sibling. So imagine 2, 3 sisters. They want to be different. They want to be individuals. They want to be unique. And one sister is very stereotypically feminine. The other or others might actually move away from more stereotypically feminine stereotypes in order to establish themselves as a different person. So it can happen, but also in all same-sex siblings and large households, we see less gender stereotyping at times because these siblings are more likely to be assigned cross-gender roles. So imagine a family with 3 boys. These boys will, at one point in time, start helping with household chores. And so they won't be able to depend on just a mother or a sister to do the laundry or to set the table or help with dishes. But they start helping out, which actually makes them less gender stereotype at the end. So it's not just whether it's an only child or a child with siblings, but also the size of the family can have impact on gender stereotyping. This is just showing the same thing. Gender identity is a person's perception of self as relatively masculine or feminine in characteristics. So just because you're biologically male or biologically female doesn't mean that you are going to take on the gender identity to the same extent as every other person in your biological group. We vary across spectrums. You might identify with a masculine identity, a feminine identity, and also androgyny, which is neither very feminine nor very masculine. This is a predictor of psychological adjustment, but androgynous females have higher likelihood of higher self-esteem and adaptability. Meaning those females who are showing a little bit less feminine identity, or they're not identifying highly with women, females, but they're not highly identifying with males either, have higher self-esteem and adaptability, but this is very culture-bound, right? Why might that be? We have seen, and we will still see, data that tells us that jobs, for example, that are identified as feminine are seen as less prestigious. For example, someone who identifies as more androgynous is basically leaving behind much of the negative stereotypes that are commonly associated with femininity in a way. And hence in the group that they are, they may actually exhibit higher self-esteem. It is also, I had read somewhere a Turkish study which showed that Turkish women who are in situations of being a supervisor or a boss, müdür, show more androgynous behavior as compared to their female counterparts who are working but at lower ranks. Again, it may not be a choice, but it might be adaptable in the sense that for the female to actually get others to comply with orders, to be listened to, they may need to tone down their femininity. We may discuss whether this is a good thing, a bad thing, wish it was happening differently, but we know that much of what comes with the feminine package also is culturally induced too, however, so I'd like you to consider that as well. So there's social learning theory and there's cognitive developmental theory. In social learning theory, it says that gender typing behavior leads to gender identity. In cognitive developmental theory, we see self-perceptions, such as gender constancy, come before behavior. Now, we talked a little bit about social learning, but we are now going to get on to cognitive developmental theory. And it says that children basically go through, I don't want to say stages, but they have to learn 3 important constructs, and they do so with increasing age. One of them is gender labeling, the other is gender stability, and the third one is gender consistency. Gender labeling is just very simply being able to identify whether you're a girl or a boy, right? So young preschool children can label their own sex and other sex correctly, but see, they're a little bit confused because when you play with the clothes and the behavior, then they are at a loss as to whether to identify this person with this gender or that gender. For example, if a doll's clothes and hair, clothes are changed and hair is cut, they claim the doll has changed sex as well. So it seems like their understanding of sex and gender is mostly dependent on how a person looks rather than biological characteristics. Gender stability, older preschool children, are better at understanding that a boy will grow up to be a man and a girl will grow up to be a woman, but they're confused by appearance and behavior still. So they have added one more thing into the classification. They understand a small boy will turn out to be a man and not a woman, and a small girl will turn out to be a woman and not a man. But they still are confused if you play with behavior and clothes. Now, gender consistency or constancy is achieved at late preschool, early school years, where sex is now understood as something that is biological, that it's not determined by behavior or clothes, and you are biologically a girl or biologically a boy, and that doesn't really change. Of course, later they'll understand it could change via surgical intervention, but normally it doesn't change. How well does gender constancy predict gender role adoption? This is a question because if the behavior comes after these cognitive achievements, then we should see predictable relations between them. And so, but we don't seem to do that. We don't seem to observe this pattern. There is a correlation between gender labeling and gender typed behavior. So once children start labeling boys and girls, they show more gender type behavior. There's also a correlation between gender stability and gender stereotyping preference of same-sex peers, choice of toys, identification with the same-sex peer group. So that's good. But children also display gender type behavior long before they reach higher levels of gender understanding. So they don't wait until they have achieved gender constancy, for example, to exhibit these gender type behaviors. So from the early stages of understanding gender, they actually start showing these gender type behaviors, and actually there's a decrease. So it basically increases until middle childhood, and then we see decreases as well, which means that this is a more fluid relation than would be expected. It's not a linear, neat, positive relation as we might expect. Gender identity in middle childhood, girls' identification with feminine traits decrease, and boys' identification with masculine traits increase here. The girls are more likely to report that they're endogenous, but here we have to understand that this is not only cognitive, but the girls' social groups, again, let's say a girl who's showing good competence at generally masculine stereotyped courses might then find that the way to actually preserve a balanced identity is to identify less with the feminine stereotype. The adjustment is linked to gender typicality. Not every one of us fit gender stereotypes by nature easily. You can, for example, think of a very tall girl at elementary school, and some of you might have been that very tall girl, or a very short guy, for example. That makes it a little bit harder to fit in. Gender contentness. Being content is being happy, being satisfied. So how happy is the child with his or her gender and what it allows them to do. And there's also the pressure to conform to gender roles. Now, if this pressure is loose, meaning if there's more flexibility, then we see greater happiness. Because the individual does not feel like they need to alter themselves in order to fit a societal frame. These, again, why is it that, so we saw, for example, girls are more likely to report that they're androgynous, and also, where was it? We talked about androgyny in general. It might also be because, as I said, these are, when they asked kids, both boys and girls, about the jobs that are mainly associated with feminine versus masculine stereotypes, with both pictures for men and women in these jobs. And they saw that for boys, that this is the male portrayal and this is the female portrayal. As you can see, they believe that females in these jobs, when the female is actually in this job, it gets a lower status rating. So how prestigious is this job, they're asking basically. In the female portrayal, we're asking girls again, but we see the same thing. So girls are not actually seeing these females in these roles as having attained prestigious status. And so this again shows that there is reasons for why girls might then identify with androgyny. Yes?
I want to ask you whether...
sorry, let's start with Sevgi first. What is it? Yes, the hormones have a role to play, but the hormones are not the whole story. So hormones can play, for example, role in activity levels. And so girls who have been exposed to more androgen in the womb can be a little bit more active, not only as toddlers and babies, but later as well when they're at preschool and even early elementary school. So they might be more happy playing tag and running around rather than playing house. So there is a role for hormones, but a tomboy, a girl who likes physical activity and plays with boys, can still identify as a girl. So the gender identity is more independent of your hormones, basically how you perceive yourself as fitting in. Yes, Selin. İpek. It may actually depend a lot, I think, on, it's a very good question, on profession too. So I had, for example, a few years back read a study that wasn't conducted in Turkey, but included Turkey as well. It was a cross-cultural study about women in academia. And it showed, interestingly, that Turkey outnumbered women in academia in many fields, including medical fields. For example, pharmacology and others. They thought that it was because being a professor at a university was a very honorable job for a woman. So males and females both thought that this is a very good job, for example, for women. And they also had high prestige and a lot of respect. And also it talked about how the Turkish, both the job the conditions for jobs and also family life, and also cheap labor that helps with childcare actually helps these women in academia to have families and also academic jobs. So I don't want to gross overgeneralize. It may as well be in corporate world, for example. We might see a pattern like this, but there seem to be exceptions too. The one study I read was about academia. Maybe it's the only exception, I don't know, but we should actually look into this too, especially if you're interested. In adolescence, does gender intensify? Yes, there's increased gender stereotyping of attitudes and behaviors. I think it makes a lot of sense. Adolescence is a time where the individuals kind of start getting interested romantically in others' genders or other partners. And so we might see more or an increase in gender-typed behavior in order to present oneself as the member of the opposite sex who is a potential interest. But there are biological, social, cognitive, there's also the hormonal changes, obviously, factors. But in mid to late adolescence, this intensification starts declining, and it should. Another way of looking at how gender typing works is basically a sort of socio-cognitive framework. And here, what they say is that there are schemas we have. We learned about schemas from Piaget. He was the first to introduce us to schemas. Schemas are mental models, now we all know. So there's a mental model for gender too, but also this model affects how we approach even gender-neutral events, objects, and concepts. And so say there's a doll, and there is, I think this is Billy, and so the idea is when the kid looks at the doll, the first thing, the gender salience filter, basically says, am I thinking about gender? Let's say the kid said yes. The gender schematic child then is the one who's thinking about gender, and he clearly says, as he's looking at the doll in his mind, I mean, these are not explicit, obviously, these are implicit processes, that I'm a boy. And the gender schema filter then asks, should boys play with dolls? This kid, who's extremely gender schematic, says no, leaves the doll and moves away. If he had said yes, then he would have to entertain the thought of, do I like this toy? So see, liking, the preference, comes after the gender filter in this way of thinking. A gender aschematic child basically doesn't say, I'm a boy, is thinking, I'm Billy. Do I like this toy? If yes, the kid plays with it. No, they ignore the doll. So that's how they think the gender schemas are imposed on children's behavior and preferences. Does this model work? Well, it seems to have good explanatory power because children seem to make decisions based on their gender schemas. For example, they may give up attractive toys that are labeled as belonging to the opposite sex. So you show us an attractive toy to boys and girls, and it's really gender neutral. It's not pink, it's not a sword. It's just an interesting toy that does interesting things. But once you label it as belonging to the opposite gender, children might actually change their preference. And remember the TED Talk that we listened to from a sociologist? She was telling us that her daughter went to get a lunchbox, and as she was reaching for the lunchbox, which she liked a lot because there was a dinosaur, it had a tail that wrapped around the box, it said boy's toy on it. And she was doubting herself as to whether she should get it or not. And then she even had trouble after they bought the lunchbox and she started using it. She kept questioning whether it was appropriate for her to keep using the lunchbox. That's a nice example of how the schema isn't inborn or anything. The schema actually develops through the child's experience with the world. And so we're not thinking that children are born with these schemas. They develop them, and culture is a major influence on how these schemas are formed, what are the contents of these schemas, and when they will be applied. Also, children seem to misremember information. They distort it to fit their schema. So you might tell a story about Mehmet, who's a nurse, for example, and over time, Mehmet might become Melahat, just because the kid remembers it as a woman nurse. They're more likely to. So it seems like it also biases our comprehension and recall of gender-relevant information. Yes. So gender typing extends, unfortunately, though, to cognitive achievement areas as well. So now we're going to lastly discuss these areas and talk about whether there is any evidence for the general stereotypes that societies hold. For verbal abilities, it seems like verbal professions, courses seem to be more feminine typed. These could be, for example, literature, edebiyat, or in early stages could be reading, writing, or edebiyat dersleri, the literature courses that you take as a child in middle school and higher. Girls seem to be more advantaged from the start a tiny bit. There seems to be some biological difference for this. There seems to be earlier left hemisphere development of the cerebral cortex for girls. And also girls show localized activation when comprehending and also producing language, whereas boys show more widespread activation. And here localization actually proves to be more efficient. But biology is not destiny. These are very small differences too, to keep in mind. Boys on average talk a little bit later, but when I say a little bit later, I don't mean they talk a year later. We're measuring it by a few months almost when you look at the averages. And there is huge, and mark my words, there's huge individual variability. So what Aisha does might be very different than what Fatma does. Every child basically has their own rhythm. We also have to realize that girls' language abilities are reinforced by the environment too. So it might be that parents find it more appropriate to read books to their girls and play with their boys, for example. And there's research that shows that parents talk more to girls. They reinforce girls' interest in language more in high school as well. When girls say that they are interested in verbal courses or verbal professions, parents seem to encourage the girls to pursue the path. Yes?
I remember you told us that parents are more likely to talk in a technical way with their sons. But if they talk more to the girls, what do they talk about?
Emotions. They talk more emotions. They explain emotions more. They both listen to more emotional expressions. And so that actually, as I said, in our lab, with the kids that we have analyzed it's a small sample and it's all middle class. 85% of the parents who came to our lab were all university graduates. So this cannot be generalized to Turkish population at large. Most of them were Bilkent graduate mothers like yourself. Hopefully one day you're going to be an alumni of Bilkent. But we didn't see any difference for emotion talk between boys and girls. We didn't really have an hypothesis about what we wanted to check to see whether it would come out, but we didn't. So it might actually have a lot to do with SES, education level, and others. But other research that's been published with Western populations have shown that in those cultures, parents use more emotion expressions, encourage more emotional expression, are more willing to listen, for example, when their girls are sad. But when their boys are crying, they're more likely to try to stop the crying. And these are all things that makes a lot of sense to us too. And I'm kind of thinking that if we had a more heterogeneous sample, we would have seen the differences. How about math, though? This is still debated. Results are very inconsistent. Girls seem to be advantaged in counting, arithmetic computation, and mastery of basic math concepts. So math is not just one skill, right? Math is a conglomerate of numerical and spatial abilities. Boys, though, become better at mathematical reasoning, abstract mathematical concepts, and geometry in late childhood and early adolescence. Now, since it emerges so late, one is led to think that schooling and the cultural influence must have an impact on it. In science, boys outperform on more complex reasoning tasks, but the differences are very small. And interestingly, it has been decreasing in the last 30 years. So if it's biologically founded, we wouldn't really expect to see these decreases either. Is the ability to engage in higher reasoning in math passed down? More successful boys, is there a biological component to this? More successful boys seem to show higher speed in computations. And they also show higher spatial ability, which leads to more complex, abstract, spatial, and mathematical reasoning. Yes?
Can it be because of they hear lots of science?
It can be that. It could be many things. The spatial reasoning one. Do you remember, I think in 204, but not all of you guys have taken research methods with me. I talked about a research where children were invited to the lab, and this was a specially created lab space for the study where there were no windows. It was basically like our basement rooms. They built the floor such that there was an incline. Right? This research is out of Temple. What they were trying to do was to try to understand whether children would actually use the incline was really tiny, so it wasn't like you were walking up a hill or something. It was just a tiny bit of incline, and so they let the kids explore the room, and then they sat the kids on a desk chair like this, right? They showed an object that was at one corner of the room. They blindfolded the kid, and then they spin the kid a few times, and then they let the kid find the toy still blindfolded, and they were trying to figure out whether the kid would, at what angle would the kid reorient, and how long would it take for the kid to find the toy, and they found a gender difference, correct? And this was males seem to outperform in this task as compared to females. However, they also checked to see which kids realized that there was an incline on the floor. The ones that actually realized went to the experimenter and said that there's something funny about this floor. And it seemed like it wasn't whether the kid was a girl or a boy, but it was whether they actually recognized that there was this incline that predicted their performance. And also, though, boys were more active. So when you let them into the room and said explore, they were more likely to walk around more, run around more, hence realized there was something wrong with the floor. The girls who ran around also realized it. So you're seeing the activity level of the child as affecting their understanding of space in this one lab experiment of this one experimental room. But also boys are allowed to play outside more. They're allowed to venture further away from home, right? And all of these, we need to also combine all of these factors when we're thinking about the spatial ability. I'm sure all of you guys, the girls I'm thinking, have been in a car where a guy, this could be your father, your brother, your boyfriend, a friend, claims that they know the way, and you get lost, and they won't let you ask directions because they know, right? And you could, yes.
Is it a cultural thing?
No, I think this is the same for my understanding of men in Europe and other places too, that they really feel superior in spatial reasoning. There seems to be some evidence. I don't want to discount it, but the evidence comes also mostly from mental rotation tasks. These are not. And there are different, I won't go into spatial reasoning. But yes. Could it be the environment? Yes, I've talked about that already. Stereotype threat, the fear of acting against stereotype, might actually push boys into trying to perform better in these subject areas and push girls out of these subject areas. And girls may benefit from spatial reasoning support during the preschool and kindergarten years. But this also is about, so you know there's been a movement, maybe you know, maybe you don't, but there's been a movement with Lego and any other company that sells blocks or building materials for kids, that most of the toys were catered towards boys. So it was building war castles, this, that. And so they try to do now girl versions of them. Lego has these pink blocks. I don't know why it has to be pink. See, I again very much agree with the TED Talk that we heard in our last lecture. In my time, so I'm a generation before you, toys weren't gendered this much. There wasn't as many toys around to start with. So there wasn't, so it also, I think, has to do with how many options there are. As the options increase, of course, some of them become sex typed or gender stereotyped. But the thing is, the ones that were neutral have disappeared. You know, that's what I don't understand. I understand having a lot of options would also result in having these gender-typed options available on the market. But where have the gender-neutral toys gone? That is a question mark. And there are fewer same-sex successful role models for women in STEM, science, technology, and math fields. The stereotypical mathematician, the stereotypical physicist, the stereotypical engineer is a woman. And again, you guys are actually quite privileged you're both interested in the subject area, and the subject area kind of matches, it's gender typed. So psychology, the psychologist in everybody's mind is mostly a woman, for example.
So before I started the department, it was a male
For you, it was you were thinking Freud?
Yeah. I was never thinking that it would be so females in impact. I have no idea. I was not thinking in like engineering. They are mostly boys, but when I came,
If you think about it, you guys are about 95% girls in your class, psychology. But look at your professors. You would expect 90% female. You won't see that. Meaning the few boys, one or two, actually move on to get higher education and become, for example, in the field of academics, professors, whereas fewer girls who actually do masters will do that. Something to think about. Yes, these are the math achievement gaps that have been, and we start, you can't read from where you are, but here is Turkey, my beautiful country. This is the average of boys minus average girls score. So you want this to be as little as possible if there's to be no difference, right? That's what you want if you don't want to see gender differences. That's Korea. Here is Italy, so we're not alone. Oh, misery loves company. France, Poland, United States, Portugal. All right. And here we go. These must be standardized scores. So here we go. And so this would be 2 standard deviations then. Norway, Sweden, and what happened to Iceland? Are the females in Iceland exceptionally gifted in mathematics, or is it something? Again, is this what you want to see? Probably not. You don't want to see a line. You don't want to see a difference, right? So this is actually interesting too, in my opinion.
what does it mean?
So they basically minus average girls score from average boys score, right? So this means that boys were this much better than girls, right? But here it says girls were this much better than boys. So if you don't want to see gender-typed influence on math abilities, then ideally you don't actually want to see this line. It should be around 0. It should be like this, Norway and Sweden. And so I had the chance to chat with a few of your peers who are females in the engineering department because they were doing a project and they came to consult, and they said that life was very difficult for them, especially when they went to, say, look for stage, internship. that all like up to that point they're led to believe that everyone's equal, and then their guy friends who have lower GPAs, you know, who have worse recommendation letters or poorer recommendation letters actually get the internships that the girls are going for, because they're expecting to see a guy fill the position. But things are changing. We all know that Ramazan here has his supervisor, whose name is Aysu. I will never forget this. Not that it's so interesting, but I was so sure that you had a guy supervisor that when, and Aysu is such a feminine name too, you know. It's not like Deniz or something. Aysu is a female. Like there's no joking about it. And so that showed to me also how like my mind had become stereotyped, gender typed when I was thinking about jobs. Personality traits, again, a stereotype that sometimes women like to entertain, I think, is that women are emotionally more sensitive. Is there any grounds for thinking about this? Girls are slightly better at emotional perspective taking. They seem to be better at understanding self-conscious emotions, but society imposes more self-conscious emotions on girls too. Embarrassment, guilt, right? There's also, of course, pride that's for both boys and girls. And of course, boys can become embarrassed too. But there are more things to be embarrassed about when you're a girl. Girls express their emotions more freely, except anger. And nobody wants to see an angry woman, right? If so, then, and if it's a debate on TV for presidency, one person might call the other a nasty woman, for example. Yes, you had a question. They may end up having to be different, but they also, girls are giving more caretaking roles, for example. It is less likely that older brothers have to look after their younger sisters as compared to older sisters looking after their younger brothers. Given that they are put in these positions, it's quite possible, and given the fact, again, that parents talk a little bit more about emotions with their girls as compared to boys. So the question is whether this difference is an inborn biological difference. So far, I don't know if there's evidence to indicate that. You don't want evidence to indicate that either. I mean, if we're going to live in a world where there are men and women and they will live in peace and harmony, I believe, you know, empathic abilities at both sides would do one another well, right? But it might be, culture might be pushing girls to develop their perspective-taking abilities for emotions. Also, I'd like to point out that, again, girls are a tiny bit better at language. Emotional perspective-taking correlates highly with language, too. So there might be underlying cognitive components to this. How do we measure empathy? We measure empathy not usually through behavioral tasks where we ask children to empathize with others, but we actually give children little stories and then ask them to reason about either characters, behaviors, or emotions. Hence, language abilities play a huge role in our measurements. You know what I mean? And so it's also, take it with a grain of salt. Personality traits. Are girls better empathizers? Are they more pro-social? Self-report sides with women. So if you ask women, yes. But the observation does not. So women like to think that they are more empathic. Yes. Also, it may not be all what it seems. So we will actually talk about aggression in the coming slide. There's also the stereotype that boys are more aggressive than girls, which, if you take all sorts of aggression into account, is not accurate. Because aggression is not just about kicking or hitting. Aggression, as you ladies all very well know, can be relational and indirect, meaning girls usually show their aggression by hurting one another with their words. And that doesn't mean that it's a better form of aggression. Usually the physical pain you forget much faster than the verbal one. And so it might be that we are not really seeing what it means to be empathic through objective lenses. Okay. The nurture instinct, as many would like us to believe, annelik içgüdüsü in Turkish, is actually a myth. And if annelik içgüdüsü, that mothering instinct, is to exist, the fathering instinct could exist as well. Fathers and mothers are not different in emotional sensitivity with their babies. Thank God. This is actually protective for the baby, right? Say, I mean, in the case of one parent being absent, say a parent passing away in childbirth, a mother passing away, or a mother suffering from postpartum depression, there is that buffer, that protective factor that the other parent is and can be as emotionally sensitive to the baby's needs as the mother. When infants, mothers respond more to their girls' distress than their boys, apparently. In preschool, both mothers and fathers respond to girls' distress more. Do you see where the empathy is coming from? They use more inductive discipline, meaning they explain the reasons for discipline more to girls. And parents spend more time talking about emotions with their daughters. So all of this combined, if girls do better in emotion perspective taking tasks, also given their verbal ability, it should come as no surprise. Whether females are born more emotionally sensitive or not, the society seems to allow them to express their emotions more freely and express them more intensely. So you could lose yourself crying, for example. Yes, your friend breaks up with their boyfriend, a lot of tears, can't breathe, and yes, but no boy, Ramazan, I don't know if it happens, you seem to be the only guy here today, for which you need to get a bonus point. But guys don't cry that freely, even if they feel as intense pain. Okay, and so, we talked about these.
Is there any biological component of that?
There doesn't seem to be. It's not like they have different tear ducts.
No, what I mean is maybe testosterone is preventing crying more than the estrogen.
I have read 2 reviews without wanting to on crying and weeping. I can tell you that there doesn't seem to be gender differences that lead to it, or hormonal. That's what research shows up to this point, at least. Sex difference in aggression, boys are more physically aggressive. The androgen actually does lead to heightened activity levels, which might result in more aggression, but there's also environmental influence. For example, physical punishment might be more severe with boys as compared to girls. And adults also respond differently to boys and girls' aggression, and peer groups also reinforce aggressive behavior too. Now, this, as I said, although it looks like boys, I always keep in mind that girls are not blameless. And if you take relational aggression, indirect aggression into account, what's relational aggression? Relational aggression is when, and we're going to talk more about this too in the next chapter, is when kids are like, you are not going to come to my birthday party. We're not going to be friends anymore. If you and I aren't friends, then you won't be friends with my best friend Aisu either, because we are best friends. Any of this sound familiar? Yes. Developing non-gender stereotype children. How can we accomplish this goal? Permitting children choice of diverse toys and activities. Trying to avoid transmitting gender stereotypes. Teaching appreciation of differences, that these differences are all valuable. Avoiding unnecessary references to gender. Providing non-gender stereotyped models. Stressing complexity of gender groups. So if you're going to teach about Einstein, teach about Marie Curie as well, for example. Encourage mixed sex interaction and discuss gender bias. Yes, Damla.
Should the
I couldn't totally hear you.
Uh,
Louder.
should we bring up non-gender stereotype children or not?
Very good question.
Yeah.
What do you think, though?
My personal opinion is should be.
We should.
Yeah.
Because?
Because I don't want to be a child like stereotyping, labeling people.
Oh, so you're saying that we should try to strive for gender neutral thinking in children. You may, I mean, it depends on your views in life too. You probably are trying to bring up, like if we ask Emre Bey here, he's parenting a boy, but I guess he first wants a responsible person, a person who's kind to others, who's productive, who's compassionate. And that could be a boy, and that could be a girl. And if his gender is going to become an obstacle for how fulfilled he's going to become, say one day this child, Toprak, is going to want to become a ballet dancer. And that's his dream, and that's what he's talented at. If his gender is going to stop him from fulfilling his dream, then probably none of us want that for any of our children. So I think this is my last slide. Okay, I'll see you on Wednesday.